Okay, first, sir, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is hosting the Climate Summit in September. So he said it's primarily aimed at getting world leaders to give ambitious commitments and initiatives for reducing emissions and for renewable energy. So what do you expect from this? We have top leaders there, like President Obama's going to be there, President Xi Jinping, basically the top emitters. Like, what do we expect from this summit?
Well, first, I'd like to say that I don't have the illusion that a single conference or a single gathering can actually change the game with respect to what we need to do to avert the climate crisis. Now, the summit nonetheless comes at a very crucial moment. It is quite comfortably distant from the 2015 deadline, which will be in Paris end of 2015, but it also comes near enough to establish that momentum towards Paris. We all know that the legitimate venue for the climate negotiations is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will culminate in a way in 2015 for a new agreement. And that new agreement will capture everything that needs to enhance ambition and urgent action so that we stay within the safe limits with respect to the adverse impacts of climate change. And the world has already decided that that threshold is at a 2 degrees Celsius threshold. If the agreement must be within the context of meeting the 2 degrees target. And I would say that the New York summit being called by Ban Ki-moon on September 23 must also be coherent and consistent with meeting the 2 degrees target. Now it's barely 3 weeks away before we see the whole world attempt at convening world leaders in New York. We would like to be optimistic about this summit, but political reality tell us that with a few weeks before the summit, we haven't really seen any major indication that the biggest polluters on Earth would be willing to put down on the table specific, ambitious, concrete targets that can change the game.
So there's no sign. But is it possible they'd announce? Because apparently that's the goal, like to get them to announce like commitments. Is it possible? Or, like, what are you expecting?
Well, what we're hearing in the news is sort of the opposite of positive indications. What we're hearing from the news from the biggest emitters, especially those who have historical responsibility, is that the 2015 agreement will not meet the 2 degrees target. This is what has been said, and that is really worrying, especially from the perspective of the Philippines being one, if not the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Not failing to meet the 2 degrees target and failing even to come up with a robust agreement by next year, for me, is really condemning countries like the Philippines to a very dreadful future.
In a past interview, you said that President Obama is the elephant in the room. Like, I wanted to ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by that in particular?
We of course try to solve the climate change problem within the purview of the multilateral system, where you have all countries around the world trying to solve it. In fact, the Climate Convention is the most universal treaty with 195 parties to date. But the Climate Convention gave birth to another legally binding treaty, which was the Kyoto Protocol. The United States is the elephant in the room because it did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, even if it represents more than 25% of the global warming pollution. Now, for us to avert the crisis, to once and for all be able to confront climate change head on, we need the United States on board. And we need an agreement that takes everyone into account, because we cannot solve climate change if we do not have all countries on board.
Let's go to the Philippines, because that was what President Aquino said, that he was invited primarily to share the Philippine experience because we have a unique role in talking about climate change from our experience, and he wants to call for action from the top emitters. So what action do we want, and what do we want to highlight from the Philippine experience?
First, what we need to highlight from the Philippine experience is the moral voice that we bring into this whole debate. The Philippines, being at the receiving end of the climate change crisis, uh, experiencing all of its impacts, and having to confront the devastating effects of climate change, we walk into that room and we bring in that moral voice. And I think that's what the Secretary General wants the whole world to see. And the Philippines has been leading the leading in the international negotiations in bringing that moral voice into this discussion. With respect to what we need to see, science is very clear, and the scientific imperative tells us that we need to drastically transform the global economy so that we prevent dangerous climate change from proceeding. That has been translated into specific figures. For instance, we need to reduce more than 40% below the 1990 levels by the year 2020, which is just 6 years away. We also need globally, and we need a zero net emissions world by the year 2050, meaning we should have phased out the sources of carbon dioxide pollution by the year 2050, or at least we have enough forests to absorb or to sequester what we cannot eliminate.
Is the Philippines also announcing any new commitments or initiatives? I understand lately there was a new strategy announced by Malacanang for climate change.
The important point that the Philippines must raise with respect to its commitments is what it is already seriously doing. For instance, we have a national renewable energy program which aims to triple the renewable energy capacity, but we also need to highlight the challenges we face in making that happen. But much of that will be done even without help from outside, and so the Philippines must take pride in being one of the leaders in renewable energy in the world. We also look at all of these commitments in the context of coming from actions from different sectors. For instance, we also want to transform our transport sector. We also want to ensure that we are able to sustainably manage our forests, because forests and the way we use land has a lot of influence on the way that emissions are poured out into the atmosphere. So we can announce these little things, noting for very importantly that the Philippines has had very little to do in terms of contributing to this problem.
Let's go to climate justice. This is really the theme that the Philippines highlights in the negotiations. And you said previously in an interview that the notion of sovereign states is problematic. Could you expound on that?
Yes, climate change affects the whole world. Now, it has reached very dangerous levels. We now live in dangerous times, with climate change being a constant threat and a grim reality. It is a serious problem, and it will take a very, very gargantuan effort for the whole international community to avert it and to stop it. Now, what we were talking about 20 years ago is how to stem this problem and nip it in the bud. But 20 years hence, now what we're talking about is how to alleviate its effects and how to cushion its effects now, because now we're resigned to the fact that climate change has reached a point where it is such a huge problem. So in that context, and having said that, what we need to understand is the climate crisis will have to be confronted in a way that all countries look at it but in a transformative manner.
You talk about the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Can you expound on that? Because you said that's really one of the key features of the UNFCCC.
The principle of common but differentiated responsibility, while it is at the heart of many international agreements, remains a very poorly understood concept, especially
Why?
as it relates to climate change. Now, climate change is also very clear. We will never be able to solve climate change if those who were responsible for the problem do not acknowledge that responsibility. And that's what we are seeing. So when we talk about common but differentiated responsibility, it means there is a common responsibility. In plain English, all of us, every individual, every country in this planet has a responsibility, but it is differentiated because those who were largely responsible for the problem must have larger responsibility, and that's where differentiation comes in. And we also all know that it is quite obvious that there are countries that have contributed more to this problem than others. And as such, the notion of that responsibility must be differentiated according to the sins that is proportionate to what each country has done to exacerbate this problem.
You say there's a sense of disappointment, and other negotiators also say that, like after every COP, what do you think is the biggest obstacle bogging down the talks? Like, why can't there be that much action that's clearly needed?
Again, I go back to the notion that climate change is not a simple problem. It's a complex problem that was brought about by the kind of economic pursuit that the whole world tries to do. Now, in order for us to avert this crisis, it's really about reindustrializing the whole world in the same scale as the first industrial revolution. That's easier said than done. And that's why this is complex, and that's why you can hear many excuses. However, my optimism lies in the fact that I believe in humanity's ability to save itself and to rise above adversity. And so I truly believe that the community of nations can find a solution to this. Why? Because the alternative is not even an alternative. It is the demise of human civilization. It is the demise of biodiversity. It is a dreadful future, especially for the poorest countries of the world and those who struggle even with basic issues such as poverty and food.
So speaking of the poorer countries, at least in compared to the developed ones, like let's go to our Philippine position going to the talks in Lima and Peru, because the summit is really geared toward that, as they said. It's not really the prime venue to negotiate. So going to Lima and Peru, what's the Philippine position and what specific outcomes are we going for this year and next year?
The Lima conference at the end of this year will be about formulating or trying our best to come up with a draft text of the agreement for 2015. So when we say drafting, this means writing text, looking at legal language, and also trying to sort out what kind of legal instrument are we talking about. So these things remain unresolved until now, a few months before Lima.
Until now.
And what we need to see by Lima is a draft, is a concrete document that has words in it that would probably have brackets pertaining to sentences or phrases that are not yet agreed. And that is what we negotiate on. And we do not negotiate on concepts as we are doing right now. We need to negotiate on words and language that will go into the agreement, because after all, the 2015 agreement will be a written treaty. It will be a written international agreement. And so before we get to that, we need to start writing the agreement, and the whole world must agree to all the words that will be contained in this agreement. That's what we need to see in Paris. And from the perspective of the Philippines, we need to see an agreement that is ambitious, which again meets the 2 degrees Celsius target. We need to see a draft that incorporates equity and common but differentiated responsibility to ensure that those who are largely responsible for this problem do not escape from that responsibility. Number 3, we need an agreement, or at least a draft in Lima that shows that transformation of the world economy is at the core of this agreement. And which means that number 4, we need to see in that agreement a very robust aspect of climate finance, of how resources will be mobilized in order to avert this crisis. We're imagining that the whole world is fighting this war. And if we fight a war, we need to mobilize every resource that we have. We have to do pep talks for every country and motivate every person on earth to be part of this endeavor to save the planet and to, in fact, save humanity.
So you talk about climate finance, and in Warsaw, that was the focus. Like you say, we fought hardest on that, like in terms of loss and damage, the GCF and adaptation. How are the talks progressing or not progressing in that direction going into 2050?
When we talk about the aspect of climate finance, there's again a lot of vagueness there. But if we look at the climate convention, climate finance pertains precisely to the resources that will be made available to countries like the Philippines so that we can be part of this global solution. Because we want to stop climate change, and the Philippines, for example, would like to put up more renewable energy facilities or power plants. We want to phase out the use of fossil fuels, but it will be easier for us, in fact, important for us to have the support for us to be able to take that leapfrog. Because if we follow the conventional way of development, it will be dirty, as many countries have done. And the intention for us is to leapfrog over that dirty approach so that we can pursue cleaner development. But we need the resources for that. But the struggle now for the Philippines is, even as we try to do clean development, we're already grappling we're grappling with the negative impacts of climate change. In fact, it's erasing the kind of development that we have worked so hard for for many decades. And we also need support for that, because that is a way for us to pursue adaptation to a drastically changed climate.
So in terms of finance, it's not yet there. I understand there is a $100 billion target, and then you say for loss and damage, it's not yet clear who's gonna fund it, how it's gonna be funded. And I think for this month, yata yung GCF, diba? It's supposed to be operationalized in September 2014, so it's not there yet, like any of these.
The problem with the levels of finance available for countries who need it to pursue cleaner development and adapt to climate change, it's just not enough. And the scale is staggering. Many of the estimates say that it cannot be below $100 billion per year for all countries that need the finance. And much of what we see right now is a wait and see game, is a waiting game for those who have the resources to be able to provide us for that. In contrast, you see a lot of money being spent for less important things. I mean, I'm not gonna list down everything, but in general, you see even a lot of massive finance being put into financing wars or financing the war machines out there. So if we truly believe that climate change is important and we need to solve it, we must provide the finance necessary for that.
Some analysts say, like when they look at the talks, it's possible that the final treaty, they say, it would be like putting together the voluntary commitments of the countries, especially the top emitters, that okay, we'll only just pledge to reduce emissions by this much, and then they'll just put it together, and that would be the treaty, which is really far off the target that you mentioned of to really keep it below 2 degrees. Is that a likely outcome?
It's very easy to lend credence to that analysis, that what we will see in 2015 as the final agreement is an agreement that's bottom-up, meaning just consolidating all of it. In the Philippines, I think we call that the potluck system, yeah, where you just pledge to bring a certain kind of food and you bring it, everyone will be happy with you. But I don't think that is enough to avert the climate crisis. If the scientific imperative or even the moral imperative is to prevent global warming from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius, it cannot be a bottom-up approach, because based on what we see in terms that the bottom-up approach right now points to a 4 degrees warmer world. And for the Philippines, that cannot be acceptable in the context of national interest, in the context of intergenerational responsibility. It's just unimaginable for the Philippines to accept a 4 degrees warmer world.
speaking of the Philippines, let's go to Haiyan. It's almost a year after the super typhoon. How did you think Haiyan changed the world's understanding of climate change? And locally in the Philippines, did things change in the way we adapt, the way we prepare for disasters in resilience? So on a global and a national level.
I think from the global perspective, many people now understand that climate change affects real people, real lives, real livelihoods. It has become clearer for many people around the world, and I think it has galvanized global public opinion on the issue of climate change. When we can link disasters very clearly to the global problem of climate change, and I think Super Typhoon Haiyan, being the strongest storm ever to make landfall in 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 uh, in in modern recorded history, has made it very easy for us to link these catastrophes, human suffering especially, with climate change. And that has opened the eyes of many people around the world. As to what the Philippines has already started to realize and recognize in the face of, of stronger challenges, stronger typhoons, more intense typhoons that will be surely coming because of a warmer world. The Philippines has put in place the necessary policies for that and has allowed the sectors to formulate their respective adaptation strategies. We've also, of course, harnessed the global solidarity and also harnessed the synergy across sectors in Philippine society to heighten the awareness on climate change. And also now we are able, for example, the Climate Change Commission is now able to look at how money is spent in the national budget, whether it responds to climate change or whether it increases the risk. So we've started that process, and I think that's very important for us. We also see massive interest and now mindfulness at the local government level to formulate their own plans and strategies and be able to look at the problem in a more holistic way. Now we see, I use the 10-letter Ayes to summarize what things are being done at the local level. We see institutions, for example, both at the national and local level, institutions being built, being strengthened to respond to the climate crisis. We see local governance units appointing their climate change officers or disaster risk reduction and management officers. We see them assembling their local councils, talking about climate change. So and second letter I is investment. So national and local government are now allocating budgets, and those are investments because we prevent losses. We also see infrastructure being climate proofed, and we are building bridges, roads, public schools, hospitals, now taking into account, even homes, now taking into account stronger typhoons, so infrastructure. We also see information being taken more seriously. Now we understand storm surges better than before. We see many communities at the barangay level crafting their hazard maps and making sure those are consistent with the maps prepared at the national level. We also see intelligence, or which is about advanced information and forewarning, early warning systems being put in place. We see implementation of environmental policies, environmental laws, which is very important as a way to prevent more losses and to reduce risk from all of these catastrophes. We see a better interface or interaction among agencies and among sectors. We also see good instruction, which is about capacity building and training. And then we have integration, which looks at the problem of climate change not just from an economic perspective, but more local government and more national government actors now look at it as having to protect the environment and also taking care of social issues such as poverty. And then number 10 letter I is inclusion. We now see a massive drive to enhance participation include women, vulnerable sectors, senior citizens, the youth, and indigenous peoples into this whole discussion and into planning. So I summarized it with 10 letter I's.
It's quite comprehensive approach. But like if I look at some of the articles when they write about global Philippines and climate change, like some of them tend to point out that like coal seems to be a problem, like the coal-fired power plants and increasing investment towards it. And our local environmental groups also point that out. So are there efforts with regard to that?
The I would say categorically that the burning of coal to produce power is the single biggest cause of climate change globally. And that's why we need a concerted effort to phase out the use of fossil fuels. Otherwise, we're locking in our energy infrastructure for a long time that will prevent us from solving the global climate problem. And that behooves the Philippines as well to pursue cleaner development by developing more cleaner sources of energy. And that's what we say about expanding our options and expanding the opportunity for us to do that. Now, we're working on the concept of socialized feed-in tariffs because we now have feed-in tariffs for renewable energy. But one of the biggest issues in our country is the cost of electricity.
Yes.
And we cannot talk about even a 1 centavo increase per kilowatt hour in this country. It's just unacceptable. So what we need to get the international community to support is that incremental cost for expanding our renewable energy resources and utilization. So, for example, we have that feed-in tariff that is generally higher than the electricity rate, price. So, the increment of that can be submitted to the international community for support, and that's your climate finance. Climate finance can address the higher cost, at least the higher upfront cost of renewable energy for the Philippines. And we are working with many sectors to develop that idea. And if we are fortunate, we can see a lot of interest from rich countries to make that happen in the Philippines for us to avoid having to build all of those coal-fired power plants.
So far, none yet. No interest yet from.
No, a lot of countries have shown interest for this, and in fact, even in the UNFCCC, the notion of a global feed-in tariff is now emerging. But when we talk about whether we will have to build all of those coal plants in the pipeline, we can still avoid building those coal plants in the pipeline if the whole world takes the problem of climate change seriously and supports this idea of socialized feed-in tariff.
I wanted to touch on the Sustainable Development Goals because that's what the UN is finalizing now. And so far there are 17 which they plan to cut, but one standalone goal is focused on climate change. Do you think that will complement the UNFCCC process? Because there's still a disclaimer there that the primary venue for climate change is the UNFCCC.
Yes, it's a very contentious issue, but I truly believe that among the sustainable development goals that we're crafting, climate change must be one of them, and it must again complement what we try to address in the climate convention. Of course, we cannot preempt what happens in the climate change convention in terms of the 2015 agreement, but it's the same countries that are negotiating this, and it's the same multilateral system within the United Nations that tries to formulate both in these parallel processes. So I think it can be done. It can be done in a way that such a sustainable development goal, and for me it's important because unless clean development and a climate-friendly development is part of your sustainable development goals, we're just kidding ourselves.
Just kidding ourselves. Okay, another event, a sideline event in the lead up to the summit is the People's Climate March. And I know that this is something that you're really supporting. And before you mentioned that because of the climate stalemate, the change has to be driven bottom up, like from the people, grassroots initiatives. So this being one of those kinds of initiatives, what do you think? What are we trying now to send a message to world leaders, like with the march and similar events around the world?
The People's Climate March is a culmination of the world's desire to pursue a more sustainable world, of the world's desire to avert perhaps one of the most serious problems that humanity has ever faced. It's also a culmination of frustration over the years. And what the People's Climate March, I think, is anticipated to be able to do is to highlight that frustration. We know that marches happen here and there and happen everywhere almost, but it is part of a growing global social movement, and I think it's strengthening. I even sense a planetary awakening where grassroots communities are now waking up to this problem and responding to the call for urgency. I've always maintained that the climate crisis will be won or lost at the grassroots level. Because in fact, the world is made up of people, and it will depend on real people to solve this problem. We're talking about individuals, we're talking about homes, organizations, local communities, local businesses. All of this, if they work together and join that global movement to avert climate change, it can happen. And we even think that is more important than an international agreement. Although an international agreement, of course, is crucial because it is a signal from governments.
Right. With your walk to Tacloban.
Pressure has been mounting for us to embark on this special journey, approximately 1,000 kilometers over 40 days, which will start on October 2nd, which is the International Day of Nonviolence, which is symbolic because walking is a form of non-violent action. And we arrive in Tacloban, which is considered ground zero, so we're walking starting from kilometer zero in Manila and arrive in Tacloban on November 8th, anniversary of Super Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda. And then we trace the Yolanda corridor and we end middle of November and go back to Manila. The objective of the walk is to raise the clarion call for urgent climate action globally. And as we walk from here, from Manila to Tacloban, many groups around the world will also be organizing solidarity walks in major cities around the world. And we hope that can snowball into a larger call for action. And with more people being part of this growing global movement, we can change the way that governments think about this problem and urge and encourage more concrete action and foster a new era of global solidarity, global cooperation that can solve once and for all solve this problem.
Lastly, you've been called the unlikely climate justice star. I wanted to ask you why climate change has become such a personal issue for you.
For me, the motivation is quite simple. Climate change has become a very serious threat to humanity. In fact, a very serious threat even to our generation. And it is our duty to hand down a planet to our children that thrives, that is good for them. And for me, it's quite simple. I'd like to be able to wake up in the morning and look my children in the eye and tell them, I've done my best to leave you a better world.